Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Freeman, and I am the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. On behalf of the Holocaust Memorial, I am pleased to welcome you to today's program with Dr. Bernice Lerner. This educational lecture is just one of the many programs taking place during Holocaust Education Week. We have film screenings and discussions, as well as more educational presentations for both adults and students throughout this week. Holocaust Education Week is sponsored by the Florida Department of Education, the State of Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, and the City of Miami Beach Cultural Affairs Program, Cultural Arts Council. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their ongoing support. I am honored to introduce Dr. Bernice Lerner. Dr. Lerner is the author of All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and many other writings on the Holocaust. She was director of Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility, where she lectured widely, conducted professional development sessions for educators, and taught courses on character education and also on the Holocaust. She was also Dean of Adult Learning at Hebrew College. She earned her bachelor's degree from Stony Brook University, a master's degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a doctorate degree from Boston University. Today, Dr. Lerner is presenting a talk titled The Ethics of Rescue, True Stories Behind Bergen-Belsen's Liberation. After her presentation, we'll take questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. Okay, Nikki, I'm on. Yeah. Thank you very, very much. I'm very grateful to the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach and all the sponsors of this Holocaust Education Week program. And thank you to those who are joining today. I'm going to share my screen with you now to begin my presentation. So I called this talk today, The Ethics of Rescue, True Stories Behind Bergen-Belsen's Liberation. Some of you who are on this call may know that Bergen-Belsen was the largest Nazi concentration camp at the war's end. And the way the liberators went about trying to save lives is interesting and important. And I've written a book from two vantage points about this story. And the two protagonists of my book are my mom, who was 15 years old at the end of the war, and Hugh Llewellyn, Glyn Hughes, the brigadier who was at that time Deputy Director of Medical Services for the entire British Second Army, who was responsible for Bergen-Belsen and for trying to save lives, rescue people. So I'm just showing you here the image of my book, which was published right at the start of the pandemic in 2020. It was published simultaneously in the US and in the UK. And while both publishers worked with the same photographs and content, they came up with completely different concepts for the cover. And I wanted you to see them because you can see more of different things in each photo. So here you see my mother, and you see the background, which is Arvika Sanatorium, a tuberculosis sanatorium in snowy Northwest Sweden. And here you see her in full form here. And you can see that she's not malnourished. This is 7 months at the end of the war. Her black and blue marks have largely disappeared, but you can see the serious look in her eyes. This is not one of your photographs of a joyful survivor free at the end of the war. She's orphaned and she's very, very sick. And she was one of those who could have easily have died at the time of the liberation. I calculate that she arrived in Bergen-Belsen about 1 or 2 weeks after Anne Frank, her peer, died there, and that she barely survived. She was there for more than a month, and it was very hard to survive even one day in Bergen-Belsen. And here you see Glyn Hughes, and you can see that he's startled by the camera. Here he is in his caravan on the premises of Bergen-Belsen, and he was a very high-level official. So here's true confession. Did he meet my mother? Maybe he laid eyes on her, but he was very high up, and he did not minister to, although he was a doctor, he did not give individualized attention to very many survivors. Here he might have been masterminding one of the things I found in his archives and files. It could have been the schedule of diets for people in various stages of emaciation. And he was calling for help from wherever he could get it. So just a bit about the structure of my book. The story is sandwiched between some anecdotes about the Belsen trial, which was the first war crimes trial to apply international law to these crimes that the Nazis committed. And it was very significant to me because Glyn Hughes was the first witness at this first such trial. It began September 17th, 1945, and had to end immediately before the start of the Nuremberg trials on November 17th. And here you see, this is an Army Talks magazine from November 11th, 1945, and it shows the inside of the courtroom and of the trial and the 45 Nazi SS officers that were brought to trial. You have to realize that there were more than 480 Nazi functionaries working in Bergen-Belsen at the time of the war. And think about it, only 45 were brought to trial. So I talk about that in the book. I talk about some of the most unbelievable incidents. Here is Irma Gracie, who was most famous for, she was hung at the age of 22. She was indicted, and she was one of the most sadistic guards. And the question that the press was very consumed with was, how does someone so young and beautiful become such a sadist? And so in between the Belsen trial, I have further sandwich of the prologue and the epilogue, which tell important incidents in both the lives of my mother, this young girl, and Glyn Hughes, and what does, for example, the brigadier do with this experience of liberating this largest Nazi concentration camp, and where does it take him in the years after the war? And some of the things of my findings were significant, even things that might impact you in your life today came out of Glyn Hughes and his experience of liberating Bergen-Belsen. And then the meat of the book, The Four Seasons. And I am going to, in this presentation, touch upon some timeline markers in the year from spring 1944 to the spring 1945, the year leading up to the fifth season, which will be the point of convergence where my protagonists cross paths in Northwest Germany in Bergen-Belsen, which will be the mainstay of my presentation. So just to give you an idea of a map where the British Army, where Glyn Hughes started out, where my mother started out. So in the spring of 1944, Glyn Hughes was at that time head of the British Second Army's 8th Corps, and they were practicing for the medical rescue, really planning for D-Day and all the details involved in D-Day, how they were going to treat wounded soldiers, evacuate them to casualty clearing stations, take them to field hospitals, and if need be, back to England. And I talk here, where was my mother? She was in the spring of 1944, sitting down at the Passover Seder table with her family in Szeged, which was in Transylvania. And then I talk about their journey, the fighting that took place, and how finally the British Army crossed the Rhine and made it crossed into Germany, and what my mother's journey was like. So the Yorkshire Wolds, which is where Glyn Hughes was chosen as a place to practice because the topography was supposedly resembled Normandy, although the hedgerows in Normandy took everyone by surprise and made the fighting really difficult against the most ferocious Panzer troops when they landed in Normandy. But just to give you an idea of something related to the ethics of liberation and Glyn Hughes's personality, which was he was a stalwart for preparedness. He had everyone involved in the 8th Corps, in the medical regiment, taking down and setting up tents. Everything was measured out exactly. The improvisation and resourcefulness was going to be the order of the day in the fighting, and breaching the fortress of Germany and fighting up through France. But he was also very planned out. even down to like how long a particular surgery was going to take, down to seconds. So it was planning, everything had to be fast, disassembled and reassembled very fast as the army was moving, and also improvisational. Where my mother started out in Siget, in this part of Europe, was when she was born there, many of you might know this, but it was Romania. And then in 1940, Hitler awarded Northern Transylvania to the Hungarians, and Siget was part of that award. So we have not a single photograph of my mom or her family from before the war. I don't know what she looked like as a child. I don't know what my grandparents looked like. All I could do really was plumb her memory. And at one point, she actually sat down and drew this map for me of where she lived. And her apartment was, even though her address was Timar Utsa, it was between this strip of land between Timar Utsa and Kigya Utsa. And she described for me, she was in a poor section of town, although there were some wealthy neighbors around. And of course, the Jews, when they were forced to leave their homes in this March of 1944, they were taken to Kigya Utsa, Snake Street. And Elie Wiesel lived right about here. When I went to visit Siget right before the pandemic, I could walk from his house to where I estimated my mom's apartment was, and it was less than 5 minutes. And I tried, though it was very hard to imagine this town of 30,000 inhabitants, 40,000 of whom were Jewish, a town that really went according to the rhythm of the Jewish calendar, the Shabbat, and all the holidays, and it was just a vibrant, vibrant Jewish community. That was all vanished, and that was all gone. But the mountains hadn't moved, and the streets, basically, even though they had different names, hadn't moved. So this is an old postcard showing you the mountains, and Siget was surrounded by mountains and 2 rivers, the Iza and the Tiza. And I could walk the distances and see how really long and far it was for my grandparents to schlep with their small children to the Nachzike Torah synagogue, from where they were marched to the great synagogue, from there to the train station. And I could sort of measure distances. So now we're going to jump ahead on another marker on the timeline, which is June 6th, 1944, the day that is so famous for the magnificent armada of Allied troops that landed in a surprise landing on the shores of Normandy, so D-Day. So we had, there were 5 beaches, the Canadians, the Americans, and the British landed. Glyn Hughes came on D+6, D+1, D+2, everything was numbered according to D-Day and what came after. And I talk about in the book about what he had to do when he landed, where he had to go on foot, where he got his first lodging, and how he had to commandeer a hospital complex in Bayeux, and what he was looking for. So I talk about the Allies and their landing. But what is really significant for you to register about this is that 150,000 Allied troops landed on Normandy, on the Normandy beaches. And on that day, on D-Day, 4,414 Allied troops were killed. Right? A large portion of them, 2,501, were American. But 4,414 Allied troops were killed. And even though there was really vicious fighting, and the days after, as they're fighting here and fighting up through France and into Belgium, each day after there were fewer Allied casualties. But on that same day, June 6th, 1944, there were more than twice the number of Jewish deportees killed, murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And every day after that, for at least a month, the same very large number, close to 10,000 people or more, were murdered every day in this factory in Auschwitz for killing. That was really preparing for this massive deportation of the last unmolested group of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, which was the Hungarian Jews living in the provinces. So we're talking upwards of 437,000 Jews being deported, shocked, having my mother had a lot of the effects of war affecting her. She experienced them as a child in her family because her father had been taken away to Hungarian forced labor. Her aunts and uncles had been murdered in the first action of the Holocaust and the Ukraine. But really, on her own self, she came shocked to this place called Auschwitz. And I'm sure many of you have read about and know about the cattle journey and the arrival here. And some of you may have seen these photographs from this amazing album that was kept by an SS officer to impress his higher ups about how smooth the killing process went. But you can see how organized these lines were, and there were lines coming from this direction too. The selection sort of took place in the middle of the ramp. But you can, if you took a close look, you would see sort of the chaos in the hearts and minds of these people who had just been taken out of their homes. And this is a woman maybe turning to a young child, and people are talking to each other. Where are we? What is this? Where have we landed? And my mother would say, here's more pictures from that notorious, very important album, actual film footage, actual photography of what the killing process was like. And here are people who were selected for the gas chambers, mostly the old and the children. And this was all taken from a transport in, like, I would say around May 18th from the same region of, but this was the part of Hungary that had been Czechoslovakia before the war. And here were women. My mother would say that in this picture, these women were lucky because she didn't have a kerchief. Her group didn't have kerchiefs. And here you see, I just wanted to show you just an image of the plunder of, people came to Auschwitz with their suitcases full of their precious belongings and things they thought they might need, because no one knew, no one was told the truth about where they were being taken. And it was called Canada. The goods were being sorted in Canada and then were being shipped to the Third Reich. And there was a lot of stories from those privileged prisoners who were selected to work in Canada, how they tried various things, whether it was daring to sabotage or steal a little something, which really always came at great, great risk. So Canada, because Canada is a vast country and it was a vast storehouse of goods. So that is just a snapshot of things along the way. More, this is just lifted from the archives, Glyn Hughes' archives in London, just the kinds of things he was consumed with and occupied with from D-Day, the Neptune Beach casualties, the total persons ashore, less casualties, drowned in battle casualties, and D+1, D+2, calculating all of that and the totals numbers of sick and wounded, general hospitals, how many beds were in each, and how he was able to commandeer them along the way, and the special kind of units that were needed to treat the soldiers, the surgical teams for chest surgery, neurosurgical units, maxillofacial, the kinds of things he was occupied with, and also just some images and pictures from his albums of both the fighting, the battling, the cheering as they were liberating towns, and the kind of warnings that the British were getting, the soldiers were getting, which showed a little bit of a British, humor, whatever. These points, between these points, your enemy lies, and he, like you, can use his eyes, so show no light and he won't get wise. And then as they cross, this is the town of Lingen, as they cross over into Germany, this German officers surrendering, they're surrendering, and what capturing that moment. So I just want to make mention of one thing as we move on to talk about Bergen-Belsen, which was why did it contain the largest number of inmates at the end of the war? Why was January 27th, 1945 chosen by the UN as International Holocaust Remembrance Day? Well, that day was the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the most notorious camp. So that was chosen as the day. But you must realize that on that day, by that day, there were fewer than 8,000 remaining inmates in Auschwitz, which were mostly the sick and maybe children who were experimented on, people who were not capable of walking. Because in the middle of January, Auschwitz was evacuated and people were taken, 60,000 prisoners were taken on a death march. So here's Auschwitz 1. There was only 1,200 remaining inmates there. Auschwitz 2, which was where the gas chambers were, had the largest number. It was about 2 miles away. And Auschwitz 3, Buna, which means synthetic rubber, where there were slave laborers, had only 600 people remaining. That was about 4 miles from the main Auschwitz camp. But Birkenau was where the mass extermination of the Hungarian Jews took place. So they evacuated. So the Nazis put the remaining survivors in from Auschwitz and on this death march, and they slowly were evacuating camps along the way as the Red Army was coming here, because no inmate was to fall alive into Allied hands. So this gave rise to the very chaotic death marches at the end of the war. And here out of Auschwitz, they were marched either northwest or west, and they were marched for about 35 miles to the western part of Silesia and 30 miles here to a place called Glywitz. And then they were put on cattle trains again, or open car wagons, and moved closer and closer deep into Germany, away from the liberators. And they were deposited in camps like Flossenburg or Dachau, which had like 30,000 inmates at the end of the war. But the vast majority wound up eventually in the spring of 1940, in the winter and spring of 1945 in Bergen-Belsen. So by the time May came around, there were 60,000 inmates in Bergen-Belsen. April. So April 15th, 1945 was the date in which Bergen-Belsen was liberated. And you must realize that this was 3 weeks before the end of the war. So how was it that this really large concentration camp was turned over from the German army to the British army 3 weeks before the end of the war? And I'll just tell you that a truth is stranger than fiction story. It involved Himmler, it involved his masseuse. And I'm not going to go into details here in the interest of time, but just tell you that there was a truce that was signed on April 12th, and the camp was handed over in the interests of health, international health, because there were at least 3 diseases that were rampaging throughout the camp, 3 epidemics, I should say, practically every disease known to humankind. But there was typhus, tuberculosis, and gastroenteritis. And lest there would be fighting in the area and some inmates escape into the countryside, they would be bringing with them these contagious diseases. So on April 12th, the Nazis pressed the remaining inmates who were still ambulatory, who could still walk, into service, cleaning up the camp because there were piles of corpses everywhere. And my mother herself had to drag corpses down this long road bisecting the camp, with 3 huge compounds on one side, 2 on the other, to a mass grave for burial. Of course, this cleanup effort had to be abandoned because too many inmates were dying on the job. The last 5 days before the liberation, nobody was given any food or any water. All these inmates who had been dumped into the camp, who had survived so much already, these were the people who were supposedly the young and the strong. They had evaded the gas chambers at Auschwitz. They had survived slave labor camps. They had endured the death marches. They were dumped here with no facilities, no medical facilities, no housing, no barracks, no bathroom, no sanitary facilities, barely any water, and they were just languishing and dying here in Bergen-Belsen. And that is what the British came upon April 15th, 1945. And I want you to bear in mind what I told you at the beginning, that Glyn Hughes, who was so prepared, who really believed in practice, and was able to easily, not easily, but always find ways around things, improvise, find ways to evacuate soldiers, find places for them to be taken, was completely stymied. No one, this was unprecedented in human history. No one had ever seen like anything like this when he came the first day, and he was shocked and initially did not know how he was going to stem the tide of death. There were 60,000 people who were dumped here in this camp, and he calculated pretty accurately, almost within a day, that 25,000 needed immediate hospitalization and that he would be unable to save 14,000 people. And that was all pretty accurate. So here I'm going to show you some images from the liberation. There were 80 SS officers who remained during the transition, and they had to help in the cleanup of the camp. And here you can see people in the background. These were the former inmates. Now they were being called displaced persons because they didn't know where they were from. Glyn Hughes would be amazed over the coming weeks to learn that there were people from all over Europe in this place. They'd come from Hungary, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Greece. And he was amazed, but when the British first came in, they were told to refer to these people as displaced persons. And here are some of the people who were in better shape watching and jeering as under gunpoint from the British officers, the Nazis are forced to help clear the camp of the corpses. And here on the bottom, you see Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who came with the British Second Army. He was their chaplain, and he is totally bereft and really pleading with Glyn Hughes because how horrible and awful it was to see people being buried helter-skelter like this in these mass graves. And there were 15 of these mass graves that were dug out. They were 12 feet deep, 12 feet deep, about 20 to 30 feet wide, and 40 to 50 feet long. And there was a lot of guesswork. So here you see a marker, grave number 2, 5,000 dead. If you go now to Bergen-Belsen, you would see beautiful monuments, but they have the same numbers: 2,000 buried here, 10,000 buried here, 5,000 buried here. And of course, they couldn't count and know the exact number. They had to do this for certain reasons. There was no choice in terms of how to bury people to try to contain the disease. And here's, you would see now, the beautiful tombstone for Margot Frank and Anne Frank. And I can promise you that this spot that they picked is not where they were buried. They were buried in mass grave. And this picture I'm just showing you because it illustrates something. You can see that this girl has a square cut out of the back of her coat. She came from a slave labor camp, and during the death march, they all had these coats that were shipped to the labor camps from Auschwitz, taken away from the Jews and shipped where they were needed for the slave laborers. And they all had squares, big squares cut out in the back, lest they try to escape, they should be easily identifiable. And here's some more images of the liberation. And this image reminded me of the story my mother told me of how they tried to scavenge for potatoes and cook potatoes. And you can just see that these well enough survivors, maybe they're going to make it and survive, are inured to their background. It was just, this was the situation. This was actually a few days after the liberation. Someone posted this recently on the internet, and they didn't know where it was taken. It was taken by the British Film and Photographic Unit in the days after the liberation, when they were charged to, much to their unpreparedness, like they were not used to photographing these kinds of war scenes. They had to do it to document the history. If anyone would dare to say that didn't happen, there would be a lot of documentation. And this photograph, these two photographs, which may not look like anything to you, were really significant to me because the 11th Light Field Ambulance on the third day after the liberation pitched a dump of tentage to get the still ambulatory inmates out of what they called huts. These barracks, they called them huts. because they were severely overcrowded, and to try to get to anyone in the huts who was dying, they tried to make some room. And my mom was one of those who went out into a tent with 4 other girls. A few days later, she was expelled from the tent and had to crawl back to the hut, where she was severely beaten up by her compatriots. So a lot of things went on behind the scenes in the days after the liberation. It wasn't a situation like, oh, now we're free, everything's free. It was a very complicated liberation. More than 2,000 former inmates died from the first food they ate after the liberation, because the British Tommies were just so generous with their rations, and they didn't initially know how to feed people whose intestines were so shriveled. So this is an image here. The water was sabotaged by the Nazis before they left, before they painted the camp over. So the Royal Engineers had to figure out a way of pumping in water. And here you see that the mayors from the neighboring towns had to come to see what their countrymen had wrought. And here are some people also from the neighboring towns who were forced to see what was going on in this camp, hidden in the woods, or not that hidden. So now, how were they going to go about trying to save lives? They came upon the British medical personnel who were there first thing, arrived at their evening meetings on a system, a triage system. They had to move very quickly, and they didn't know how to go about saving as many lives as possible. So they decided that they were going to have the evacuation hut by hut of the inmates whom they thought had a chance of surviving. And a medic would go in and mark those who were still breathing with a red cross on their forehead. And there's a lot of stories about what happened with that. So people sometimes found a piece of chalk on the ground and marked their own foreheads, and all kinds of stories behind the scenes. But they would take them in these contaminated ambulances. See the men from the light field ambulance wearing these sort of hazmat types, protective suits, because everyone had typhus. Take them in these contaminated ambulances about 1.5 miles away to this cavalry stables that was set up with 60 tables, where German nurses from the area, right, they had a shortage of personnel. They weren't anticipating having to try to rescue this many people. German nurses were sponge bathing and spraying the skeletal inmates with DDT and evacuating them in clean ambulances, putting them in these sheets and evacuating them to makeshift hospital room. And my mom, I think, was evacuated on one of the first days after they began this process. And this really at least gave her a fighting chance of survival. So I'm going to read now from the bottom of this. These are some stats. I just should make mention that the hospital that was set up was this pretty quickly, within a month or two, named the Glyn Hughes Hospital, because those survivors who had some medical background and knowledge were asked to help out in the relief, and they saw Glyn Hughes's compassion and his moral drive to try to save as many lives as possible, and they named the hospital after him. There were 14,000 patients in the Glyn Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe, 1 month after the liberation, May 19th, 1945. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried in Bergen-Belsen. There were about 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. It took a long time to stem the tide of death. There were only 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen 2 days after its liberation, right? There was battles being fought in the area, and they didn't have medical units to spare. So I discussed in my book what Glyn Hughes did and how he tried to bring some units to Bergen-Belsen. 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry, the place for washing and disinfecting survivors. And I'll just read one more. There were about 25,000 inmates who had our more recent arrivals, like a lot of people arrived in the week before the liberation, and they weren't necessarily in horrible shape. If they were able to walk, and the test was like, could you walk 3 steps? Like that was a test. You were considered fit. You were transferred to the formerly Wehrmacht Transit and Rehabilitation Barracks. And of course, this was very permeable, right? Some people who were deemed fit wound up in the hospital and back and forth. So Glyn Hughes, here he is in this picture here, he would not allow the British flag, the Union Jack, to be hoisted on May 8th, which was Victory in Europe Day. It took time after in order for things to right themselves, or at least get some order going in this chaotic place that was Bergen-Belsen. So when the last hut was evacuated on May 21st, there was a ceremony at which flamethrowers shot these flames into the last barracks, burned it down. There was a speech, there was ceremonies, and it was a ceremony, and you can see here there were some DPs, displaced persons, who were well enough, and British soldiers who came to watch this event. And it was pretty significant. This little country, Maldives, off the coast of Sri Lanka, for their 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, issued these stamps. And one of them was of the British troops burned the last hut at Belsen. You can see the effigy of Hitler here and here. And so they made a stamp out of this image. So in terms of the ethics of liberation, one of the important things to understand is that the situation was unprecedented in human history, and it was something for which the Allies were completely unprepared. But what was clear was the moral motivation to try to save as many lives as possible. And some of the people who came to help the various units had a very hard time looking at these prisoners and the way their sort of animalistic behavior, like a lot of crazy things were happening on the ground. Like the nurses saw like an inmate who could, former inmate who snuck out into the countryside and brought back half a calf and hid it under his bed. Like people did not behave like normal human beings. So they had to really look away and try to see the humanity who these people were. Another part of the ethics was the readiness to break rules. They couldn't go by normal army protocol which would have entailed waiting for permission to do certain things. They had to immediately get into action and get into gear. They had to be really resourceful and innovative. I mean, if they needed, what do you do when you need like 10,000 blankets? Like, where are you going to get them from? Where are you going to get bedpans? Where are you going to get all kinds of things that you need? And so they had to be really resourceful and innovative. And I talk about how they got certain goods that they needed, and little things like my mother had this memory where she was on a bed, like a mattress with a paper sheet, and sure enough, I read in one of the nurses' accounts that they didn't have enough sheeting. They had to use paper. Decisive action, really trying to move as quickly as possible, making really hard decisions, really, such as in terms of how people were going to have to be buried. Compassion, seeing the humanity in these human beings who had suffered so much, and receptivity to unfolding phenomena, which takes me into another chapter, which is really what happened when some of these inmates some of these former inmates who had within them some physical resources, stamina to recover. What was it like when they displayed their true humanity, and to really see them and see what was going on in the camp and allow oneself to be moved by it? So here I'm just going to read you one excerpt from Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonen's writings. And let me just see. There was a moment when a very large quantity of lipstick arrived, right? They were trying to get materials and food and clothing from wherever they could. And he writes, "This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer, unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering about with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips." And I will leave it to you to think about what something like lipstick might have meant to some of these displaced persons. So this was a sign that was erected in Bergen-Belsen. It's not there now. It's not there anymore, but this was immediately after the war. 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died, all of them victims of the German New Order in Europe and an example of Nazi culture. And I think maybe I can pause here for a minute in case anyone has any questions. And then if there's time, I can go into what really was taking place in the immediate aftermath of the liberation. So why don't I just stop the share for a moment, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lerner. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You said your mother was taken from the tent back into the hut. You said she was injured. I didn't quite understand what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, she was taken to the tent because she was still able to walk, but she was really sick at that point with tuberculosis and typhus. And when it was her turn to close the flap door of the tent, she was too weak to get up. So her sister, who was with her, volunteered to do it for her. But there was an older girl in the tent who said, if you are not able to perform your duty, you have to go back to the hut. So she crawled on all fours back to the hut. And there she tried to reclaim her spot against the wall. Like everything meant something. And if you could rest your back against the wall and not be in the middle of the hut, that meant something, right? Her back was very sore from the TB. And the women, this was probably 6 days after the liberation. Everyone had already had something to eat and some water, but the people there were so angry at her that she dared to ask for her spot back, that they beat her to a pulp. She was unconscious. And her last thought before she lost consciousness was, we will never be human beings again. And she would never blame the people who beat her up because they weren't human. It wasn't their, fault. But in the first picture I have of her, I think it's in the book, you can see that she can still see, this was like taken a few months after the war, she still see the black and blue marks on her face.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions they would like to ask?
Hello, I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, I just want to introduce myself. My grandmother is a survivor from Bergen-Belsen. She is still alive. She lives back in Venezuela. And she has wonderful stories about, and what I mean wonderful, obviously, I mean after the war and how she reunited with her family. And of course, she has a lot to share about when she was a kid in the camp. One of the things that she mentioned, and she constantly refers to it as the lost train. And I wanted to see if you wanted to provide more information about the lost train and the many thousand Jews that were on it, and that and the story about the train.
Was she on the train?
She was, yes.
So it was so chaotic at the end of the war, and these people who were on the lost train were evacuated from Bergen-Belsen before the liberation, and they were, I don't know if they were being taken to be traded by Himmler. I think Himmler ordered that train to leave Bergen-Belsen. There was a lot of chaos, but I believe they were liberated by the were they liberated in Magdeburg? I'm not sure where they were, but there were a couple of trains that went that were taken out of Bergen-Belsen, and I think there have been books written about that train too. But that is a whole other story. But your grandmother was very fortunate in a way to be on that train, because I think the people had a much better chance of surviving.
Yeah, well, she mentioned that, they saw the trains and they were, excited that hopefully that would take them somewhere, but they call them the lost train because what they wanted is to keep going on the train to find where they can kill the rest of the Jews that were remaining. Yeah. And she didn't know at the time, and she only saw the train stopping and then turning around, because all of the trails were bombarded. And so at the end, there were 2 Russian soldiers that stopped the train, and they liberated it only with a few Jews left. And they said, just go to the nearest town and see what you can find. But it was, it was deceiving that not even the liberation was, a moment of happiness. It's very tragic, even at that time. And I want to say that if you have any questions or if you want her, I can put you in contact, and she has wonderful or amazing information that could be shared. And she gives a lot of speeches and tries to get young people involved into what happened. And I've been trying to help her get some exposure as well, because I think it's critical.
Incredible story and an important story, and it's wonderful that she's still with us and that she's talking about it. And I would love to learn more about her story. And if you could shoot me an email, you could, on my website, there's a way just to write on my website, contact me, and I can get back to you and learn more about her and who she is. And so just go to bernicelerner.com, and I'd love to be in touch. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation.
That was fascinating, David. Thank you for sharing with us. Does anyone have any other questions? While people think of questions, Bernice, would you like to share a little bit about what happened after liberation?
Yes. So this is very much part of Glyn Hughes's story, because he even though his tour of duty ended, he kept going to the DP camp. What happened in Bergen-Belsen, and it was in the British zone, they set up a displaced persons camp. The British, the first thought they had in mind was everyone should be repatriated, go to your home, go back to your homes. Well, maybe if you were from France or Holland, the Western countries, maybe you could consider it more readily than those from Eastern Europe, those from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. It did happen occasionally, but very few people went back there, to stay, at least, because their entire community was destroyed. And so they set up a DP camp, and eventually it had like 12,000 people in it. And they were waiting to see what their future would bring. And just one of the astounding facts is that the rate at which people were coupling and getting married and trying to rebuild their lives. And this you saw in spades in the DP camps all over Europe. There was maybe a lot of mismatches because people just wanted to build families again. Some people had lost everyone in their family. And so this is just an example of a ketubah that the rabbis came up with in Bergen-Belsen, which made a certain provision because it was complicated. Like, what if you didn't see your spouse being killed or you didn't know what happened? Remember, most of the survivors were in their 20s and 30s. Some of them had young families and some of them had been married. So 420 men and 300 women who had been married and didn't know the fates of their spouses were granted permission to remarry. And with a caveat, there was something built into the ketubah that made provisions should your spouse turn up, your previous spouse turn up, and they should be allowed to have something material from you. So anyway, this was a historical phenomenon because after the war, there was a baby boom. Excuse me. Excuse me. The largest baby boom like in human history. In the years after the war, people were coupling and having babies. There's about 2,000 babies were born in the Glyn Hughes Hospital, which was a source of enormous pride for him. And the life in the DP camp revolved around these small children. So you can see there was a guy in a kindergarten, and there are now 2,000 people, hopefully most of them are still around, who are in their 70s, roaming this earth, and they're part of this community born in this very special place and time. And there was also a lot of talent and resourcefulness among the survivors. This woman decided she only wanted to get married in a white wedding dress. So her husband worked in the canteen, and he wound up for like 2 beans of coffee and some cigarettes buying a parachute from a German, a silk parachute out of which was fashioned this beautiful wedding dress. And this is on display at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this dress, this woman, Gina Turgle, married a British soldier, and he had a dress fashioned for her out of British silk parachute material. And this is hanging in the Imperial War Museum. And this is just an example. This is a woman who survived. She's 19 in this picture. And at the end of the war, she found some old German soldiers' wool socks, and she unraveled the socks and she found 2 sticks and she made herself this sweater. And in the DP camp at the end of the war, there was pretty soon after, they assembled these talented actors and actresses and had a concentration camp theater that gave performances, and that were very cathartic for the audience, right? Because they had just experienced some of the things that were being acted out. And so there was a theater troupe, and there was the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training came to the camp to provide people with some skills to help rebuild their lives, whether to become seamstresses or electrical engineering. And here you see dental technician school. And there was a police force. There were 12,000 people. It was like the size of a small town. So they had a Jewish police force in the displaced persons camp. And just here's some documents from the hospital. This woman is having her 2nd baby, is born in the Glyn Hughes Hospital. Here was an artist who drew a series of 11 drawings while he was in the hospital, Glyn Hughes Hospital. And this says, "What we survived, what now? What now? What was going to be?" And this is not my mother's question. It was a big what now, but she could not make any decisions for herself, right? She was 15 and she was deathly ill. So she had a different, very long post-war chapter in Sweden. And here was a newsletter put out, and green ink was a real novelty. This was put out by the Jewish committee in the neighboring town of Stella, and it's called Our Voice, and it still exists. It's a beautiful magazine now put out by Belsen descendants in Israel, and you can even see it online, called Our Voice. And one of the major things that was really, all these things were soul-turning experiences for someone like Glyn Hughes, who was 52 years old and had seen all the horrors of war, which is where the title of my book comes from. He said, while he testified at the trial, he said, "I have seen all the horrors of war, but nothing to touch this." And he was his soul was really turned that summer, and he became a real champion of the survivors. So while it was British official policy to try to get people to repatriate them and not to have them look toward Palestine for their own political reasons, Glyn Hughes was really on board with the survivors, and they were agitating to go to Palestine. So open the gates to Palestine for us. We need a homeland. Our tragedy, this great cataclysm that befell us, should never befall the Jewish people again. We need to have our own country. And here's Yessel Rosensaft, who was diminutive in stature, but a great, great personality, and who rallied survivors from all different backgrounds, and whether they were Orthodox or Zionist, and just rally them around this cause. And here, this is a picture of Jewish soldiers from the British Brigade. They were fighters in Palestine. They came to visit Bergen-Belsen. And it was really something for the DPs to see a Jewish man in military uniform. It really buoyed them. And here, this is the formation of the beginning of a sports group and a kibbutz, later kibbutz. And now I'm going to play you a brief video by Zvi Asaria Herman Halfgott, who was a rabbi. He was trained, I believe he was trained in Budapest, but he was from Yugoslavia. He was in the Yugoslavian POW camp, really helped the people he was with, and as soon as the war was over, made his way to Bergen-Belsen to see how he could be of help.
לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם, לקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה נקודה מעניינים, שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות, בגלל המחלות, עם הקבר אחים. ערכים. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, על זה שוב כן 30-20, וזה כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שהאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד, שאלה האישה, שמעתי דברים שלו, חזר בזה, נפטרה. צעקתי בשבילה, אמרתי, זה בלתי אפשרי. אני מפרשת ממך. אז יודעת מה? בדרך כלל המקרים מועדונים, אז אנחנו נגבור אותם. אנחנו נפעיל אותם בפעם, ואנחנו כאילו פתאום כשאני רציתי כבר הזכות הגדולה שנתת לנו לקבור תקציב בידיים. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, התחלנו לשקול דרך כמה גם יורדים, ואחר כך בית ספר, כן. אז אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. הקראנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. כמה חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה עסקתי עד 48, כן. לא בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו'. אבל אני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל המשפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם מקופה בקידושים שאני מחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היום בגלל האלף כשאני החזקתי בידיים. היום האלף.
I was always, I could listen to him over and over again. It was a beautiful account of a very moving episode. And now I'm just going to end my presentation by just telling you a little bit that about just showing you some images that aren't in the book, but that hint at the epilogue. And here's Glyn Hughes, and you can see sort of the seriousness in his eyes at Bergen-Belsen. And he was a great sportsman, so here's a picture of him a few years later. And yeah, he did some remarkable things in his post-war life. He, as someone commented to me who knew about him, he lived many lives in his one life. And here's my mom and her sister when they were young women in Sweden. And here's her wedding picture to my dad. And my dad was also a survivor. Here's a picture of him working in the kitchen of a DP camp. And here was my mom, and I just lost her. She died just a few weeks ago, and this was her pretty recently. She was speaking to groups of school children really all over the world through Zoom during the pandemic, and before that in person. She lived on Long Island. It was a very, very sad loss for me, but I'm very grateful that she had this final chapter of her life where she got to do this really meaningful Holocaust education work. And that is it. I'm going to stop the share now, and I'm happy to take any other questions if anyone has it.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Lerner, for sharing your mother's experiences. It means a lot to us to hear them. We had one question in the chat. How did they manage reunification with family members in other camps, countries, etc.?
Well, they had no internet, right? They had no Facebook, so there was constant networking. People were, whoever the survivors who were able were going anywhere they could. They were going in every train station. There was posts, there were bulletin boards. People would post, "Did you see my loved one?" on posts on train stations everywhere. Everybody was asking. There was Red Cross was coming in and taking names of survivors and trying to post lists and get word out. And slowly, you know, people found out, if they were very, very lucky, that someone in their family survived. People were traveling to different camps, asking around, but they tried to circulate, the Red Cross tried to circulate information, whatever newspapers could be printed, whatever towns. A lot of people who were strong enough tried to go back to their hometown, and there was a lot of word of mouth. And occasionally you would hear something decades after the war, someone would find out that a family member survived. It wasn't always so clean and easy. Like, you know, in the later years, more recently, people would submit paperwork to Yad Vashem about people who survived. But there are so many unfinished stories, and that we'll never know, you know. My father was really lucky. He found out that a very astonishing story, like an incredible against all odds, but 5 of his siblings survived the war, and each one was in a situation that was, the odds of them surviving was minuscule. So, but each one, how he found out about each one was a big story. These reunions were incredible.
I have a question. How long was your mother in Sweden, and did she meet your father there?
Yeah, so the Swedish government, in a humanitarian gestures, took in about 7,000 of the sickest survivors from Bergen-Belsen, aiming to rehabilitate them, also thinking that 6 months they'll be on their feet, they'll be repatriated, they'll go home. My mother was in Sweden for 10 years. She was in and out of TB sanatoriums for 10 years, and she met my father in Sweden. He actually took a trip. He was a United States citizen by that point. He took a trip to Sweden to meet her, and they married in Sweden.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I have a question. What would you say in today's world, knowing that, you know, so few survivors are left, and that we kind of have a responsibility to transmit this message? What are some of the ways that you have found the best, try to communicate to large audiences or try to get inspire people about worrying and speaking about this subject.
So it's up to you and me. I'm a 2G, you're a 3G. There's organizations that we could belong to. I think that there are 2G and 3G organizations that are doing marvelous work. And more states in the United States are mandating Holocaust education. And in my case, every person has to decide for themselves. And certainly you probably know, maybe you have siblings or cousins, or, not everyone is interested or able to carry forth the message, but thankfully there are many who are. And in my case, I'm a writer, so I wrote this book, and I've tried to put word out there, and I'm working on a book now about my father, and that's what I do. I try to write articles occasionally and write, and there was a time when I taught courses at the college level and high school level on the Holocaust, but right now I'm devoting myself to writing. But everyone has to decide for themselves. But your grandmother has a really important story. I hope that she gave her testimony. I hope that you carry the ball forward and find ways to share it. And again, it's really through these organizations, they can help you. They do wonderful things, wonderful work.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end it on. If there are no other questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Bernice Lerner for this fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lerner.
Before we leave, I just want to point out, as I put in the chat, the Holocaust Memorial's website, we have Holocaust Education Week for the rest of the week. And as I had mentioned before, this is just the beginning. So today is Monday. Tomorrow we have a program. We have the film 1945. It is live streaming. So you register and you'll receive the link to watch the film for 48 hours. On Wednesday, we have two programs. In the morning at 9 a.m., we have a live play, The Education of Rachel Genuth, which is about Kristallnacht. Also on Wednesday, November 9th at 11 a.m., we have messages from survivors with the co-founders of the Memory Project Productions. And then on Thursday, we have two events, one at 9 a.m., which is Theresienstadt, Story of the Ghetto Through Its Art, Music, and Poetry with Yad Vashem educator Liz Ellsby. Also on Thursday at 1 p.m., we have the Tattoo Torah film discussion with Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff and myself. And then finally on Friday, all day again, we are doing a film screening of the documentary The Ritchie Boys. And like 1945, you register and then you receive the link to view it for 48 hours. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email address in the chat. Otherwise, thank you again, Bernice Lerner, so much. We really enjoyed having you with us. And have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. I'm going to close the room now.